Just after noon on April 23, 2018, a 25-year-old male picked up a white cargo van that he'd pre-ordered weeks earlier from a rental car company. After acquiring the 10-foot vehicle, the individual travelled towards Yonge Street, a heavily patroned section in the north end of Toronto. On reaching the intersection of Yonge Street and Finch Avenue, the male accelerated and drove the van onto the nearby sidewalk, travelling and hitting pedestrians for nearly 2.5 kilometres. The incident resulted in the deaths of 11 people and multiple people were injured. Shortly after the attack, Detective Rob Thomas with the Toronto Police Service was tasked with interviewing the offender. With limited preparation and only a few hours to prepare, Rob was presented with the challenge of interviewing the offender and trying to not only elicit an account from him, but to understand why he committed the horrific offence.
I want to talk to you, okay? We're going to spend a good deal of time together, okay? It's important that I talk to you, all right? I've done a little bit of reading, and I know a little bit about involuntary
celibacy.
Celibacy, right? So being celibate, involuntarily celibate. What does that mean?
That means celibacy means someone who never has sexual intercourse.
Right.
Involuntary celibacy means this wasn't your choice. You essentially have been thrown into true forced loneliness and you're unable to lose your virginity.
Right.
This is especially painful for young males.
Right. That makes sense. When did you first, sorry, you mentioned this and I forgot. When did you first go on to 4chan?
2014.
2014, and specifically when in 2014?
May 23, 2014.
And how were you able to remember that?
Because I remember that was a very significant day.
Okay, what was that?
That was when Elliot Rodger decided to essentially commit an uprising, a beta uprising, if you will,
right,
against the Chads and the Stacys. It was a beta uprising.
A beta uprising? Okay.
Although he didn't call it a beta uprising at the time. Someone else who was inspired by him by the name of Chris Harper called it a beta uprising sometime in, actually I believe it was October 1, 2015.
It was Elliot Rodger who was the father of
basically
this.
the founding forefather of the entire movement.
Right. So explain to me this movement. What's this movement about?
It's basically a movement of angry incels such as myself who are unable to get laid. Therefore, we want to overthrow the Chads, which would force the Stacys to be forced to reproduce with the incels.
Right. Okay. And when you say incels,
involuntary celibate.
Celibate. So that's just a short form for fellas who
can't get laid.
Can't have sex. Right.
Welcome to the Targeted Violence podcast. I'm delighted to be joined by Rob Thomas, a former detective with the Toronto Police Service, to discuss the Toronto van attack and his experience with interviewing the perpetrator.
Rob, thank you for joining us on the Targeted Violence podcast. It's a delight to have you here to obviously talk about a very serious subject, which you were involved in a very serious police case, the Toronto van attack. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me, Nathan. I'm honored to be part of this, and hopefully, through our conversation, we can espouse some good information for law enforcement moving forward. So, yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
Now, we've spoken about doing this podcast and the aims of doing this and what we would like to achieve in us talking together. And one of those was that we wanted to make sure that we pay our respects to the victims and ensure that our perpetrator doesn't receive any more notoriety. At the time of sentencing, Justice Malloy for this individual, this attacker, noted that one of the issues with which I have struggled is that the accused committed a horrific crime, one of the most devastating tragedies this city has endured, for the purpose of achieving fame, and he has achieved that purpose. Now, I know you've been approached multiple times over the years by TV networks and other organisations to complete an interview and to provide some insight into your interview with our offender. And to date, you've declined that.
That's correct. Yeah, yeah. So I'm speaking out today just simply because I think this is an important platform to train and inform primarily law enforcement and individuals who are involved in similar situations like this. The matter is now over 7 years, or it's coming up to 7 years now. But I just want to make it clear that we're not going to mention his name, and I'm only doing this simply because out of respect for your work and the purpose of this podcast is to essentially inform and train law enforcement moving forward. So my main concern is just the the feeling and respect for the individuals involved and the families that that suffered from this terrible tragedy. So.
No, I appreciate that. Now, for our listeners that won't be familiar with you, you've had a long career in the Toronto Police Service. Are you able to give us a bit of a guide to your background and the number of years that you were in the service and the various roles that you had?
Yeah, so I recently retired from the Toronto Police Service January of last year after completing over 35 years of service. I was 22 when I joined, so what does that make me now, 28? 20. And I had a wonderful career, and I at a very early juncture within my career development, I had a chance to attend our college for some advanced criminal investigative training. And in doing so, I was in a classroom with many other young detectives. This was probably, I'm going to guess, the early 90s. I joined in 88. So it was early 90s at this point. I had been moved out of uniform. And as part of the course that I was on, there was a seasoned detective by the name of John Sinclair, who unfortunately has since passed away. And I never really had a chance to speak to John about the impact of his presentation. But he gave a presentation on a case study involving a serial rapist. He was a member of our sex crimes unit, and as part of this case study presentation, he showed a small portion of the interview that he had conducted with the suspect, and in doing so, the suspect confessed. And I was early in my career; I was my mid-20s at that point, and I was just absolutely taken aback by the fact that this detective was able to get this suspect to talk, and the profound impact that had, at least from my perspective, on the overall case. And in hindsight, I don't think John Sinclair was relying on anything, that was grounded in science or research. I think he was probably more relying on just his experience and his time within the investigative field. But it really struck me as something absolutely phenomenal. And so, at that particular juncture of my career, which was very early, I decided to make it my purpose to get into a unit where I could ultimately begin to interview suspects, primarily suspects who are involved in very serious cases. So we have a polygraph unit in the Toronto Police, and it's generally staffed by 2 members. And the mandate of the polygraph unit, when I eventually was able to get in, I applied initially back in the early 2000s, and I was sort of late 90s, I guess, and I was declined. But then I applied a second time in 2006, and I was successful. And so in doing so, I transferred to the polygraph unit. Our primary responsibility, of course, was conducting forensic polygraph tests in support of criminal investigations that were being conducted by the various different sections and units and squads throughout the Toronto Police. We employ about 5,500 members and about 2,000 civilian staff. We're the largest municipal police service in Canada. And so it's a relatively robust, complex organization. We have about 17 separate police divisions or stations, precincts if you're American. And so I was conducting a lot of polygraph tests for the various different units and investigators for these for these different sections. And I began to develop a skill and an interest in conducting post-test interviews, primarily on individuals who had failed their polygraph test, doing a lot of learning and reading. And then as part of our unit mandate, we ultimately were required to teach younger detectives at our college how to conduct interviewing. Interviewing and interrogation is what it was called back then. Interviewing essentially for cooperative individuals, interrogation for uncooperative individuals. And the majority of the training was focused around the read technique, the read 9-step interrogation technique, with the incorporation of behavioral provoking questions and so forth. And I was very very intrigued by all of that. It was a successful career, and and then what happened was in 2010, my partner left. I was alone in the office, so we were looking for a second member to come in, but there were other priorities that needed to be addressed first, so I was kind of put on the back burner. And while I continued to do forensic testing, forensic polygraph testing and interviewing, I was also teaching. And a very good friend of mine, colleague, gentleman by the name of Kerry Watkins, I'm going to mention him because he had a profound effect on my understanding of investigative interviewing. And he is essentially the individual who I credit for a great deal of my success following 2012. So in 2012, Kerry, who I'd known from previous work, previously working in other units, he'd come to our college and he took over the investigative interviewing training program. And upon learning that we were teaching, I was teaching the read technique, he promptly fired me. So I was without a job teaching, and despite the fact that Kerry and I were good friends, he held his own, and I will say this: he came up against a lot of resistance within our organization. Came up with a lot of resistance from me because I was using a technique that I thought was valid. It was legal. It was extremely. I was extremely successful using the read technique, and he held his own and he remained firm. He went to the UK on his own dollar, learned the peace program, came back and implemented it. And so from that point on, I began to learn more about what it meant to conduct an evidence-based interview model that was founded on empirical evidence. And in doing so, Kerry and I began to work together. In Canada, our laws are a little bit different than other jurisdictions in the world. And so we saw an opportunity to, instead of butt heads, I guess, for lack of a better word, we and I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that we knew each other. We started to collaborate, and so in 2012 we changed our training program from a read technique to a piece, primarily a piece technique. 2015, a second examiner came into my office, and our mandate was then expanded to include not only forensic polygraph testing and training the piece model, but we expanded our mandate primarily around the topic or around the focus of interviewing suspects who are in custody and charged with relatively serious, high-profile cases. So we became the subject matter experts around interviewing. I think we were probably we were certainly the most informed. My partner and I were the most informed, at least within our service, in terms of latest current practice and the science behind interviewing. And so from there, it just sort of it continued to move forward right up until last year when I retired, we again expanded the unit with one more officer. So we have 2 polygraph examiners with the Toronto Police. We have a forensic interviewer who is solely focused on interviewing suspects in high-profile cases. And we have a child forensic officer as well. So the unit's been expanded to 4 now. So.
And so I imagine for most serious crimes, homicides, serious sexual offences, you're coming in as a specialist interviewer to take the lead on interviewing the suspect for that.
Yeah, that's essentially the role. So one of the things I wrote a number of papers to try and convince our executives within the Toronto Police Service the importance behind this shift, because our role initially in polygraph up until 2012 was simply just to conduct forensic polygraph interviews and teach interviewing. And in 2012, with the introduction of the PEACE interview model, I began to realize that there was a need for specialist interviewers, forensic interviewers who understood the science behind interviewing. We could no longer rely on the anecdotal techniques of the past or the pseudoscientific models that we were practicing. And I made an argument that we were placing our organization's reputation at risk. There was the potential for false confessions, miscarriages of justice, and so in doing so, I got the backing of our service and expanded the unit. And I began solely focusing in 2015, on in custody investigative interviewing of suspects charged in high-profile cases. Now, it was a transition. It wasn't as if one day we were one organization and the next we were a completely different organization. There was a transition because there was still, to some degree, resistance, especially within our more specialized high-profile squads like our homicide squad and our sex crimes unit. So there was some resistance in terms of making people aware of the potential problems with the practices of the past. But by 2015, by far, we'd made it very clear that we were the best individuals for the purposes of conducting interviews. I would equate it much to the same example that you wouldn't. I mean, we look at our forensic officers today, and they do an excellent job collecting physical evidence at a crime scene, whether it's blood or fiber or taking photographs, measurements, various different forms of DNA evidence that can often be collected at a crime scene. We wouldn't download that task on an average detective or police officer in the field. And the reason why is simply because that particular role deserves a tremendous amount of education and experience to perform. And even if you're a forensic officer, you're not likely going to be conducting examinations of serious crime scenes until you're well within your comfort zone. Yet, strangely, for some reason, we felt that we could interview suspects using the old formula. The detectives of the day or uniformed officers could interview suspects and take a statement and expect that it's going to that they're going to elicit the greatest amount of reliable information and be able to defend that statement later in court. And that's just not true. So thankfully the Toronto Police is a very progressive organization, and they quickly saw the importance behind developing a specialist interview role within the service. And so in doing so, they I had the opportunity to fulfill that role. So yeah, it was a wonderful experience.
So by the time the Toronto van attack occurred, you were well and truly embedded as a specialist interviewer, and you'd transitioned from predominantly using the read technique for several years through to adopting the PEACE model and becoming very specialized in that.
Right. Yeah, and yeah. And so not only were we applying it, but we were also teaching it as well. So the Toronto Police had changed or revamped the training program at the very core level of the organization. So, we were teaching young officers and even seasoned detectives who likely were using the READ technique or other forms of guilt presumptive models to the peace model. So, I mean, it wasn't without its, like I said, it wasn't without its pushback. But our work in polygraph, both my partner and I, we had some really good success, and we had interviewed a number of high profile suspects prior to April of 2018, and so we had garnered a fairly strong reputation within the service. And so, what we found was there wasn't a lot of reluctance to hire us essentially to conduct the suspect interview. It freed up the investigators to do other work. They knew that the product that we were providing or obtaining, was certainly at par, if not, better than the average detective. And so, and that we could defend that product later on the stand under cross-examination. Yeah, I think we'd done a fairly good job, and I think our work showed for that. So.
Yeah, I think that's a great model that you've adopted that you have over there in Canada, particularly around bringing in specialised interviewers with that expertise that may not necessarily have the nitty-gritty knowledge of the case, but they bring other strengths that can then really set up that interview. And of course, you can get briefed and upskilled on the various sort of details around the case. And then bring that in. Particularly, if you've got good support from an investigation team, you can get up to speed pretty quickly on that. So I think that's a great model that you're employing over there in Toronto.
Mm-hmm. So,
so shifting over now just to look at April 23rd, 2018. Talk me through your day, and you've obviously at some point learnt about there's been an attack in Toronto, and then you've been approached to carry out the interview with the attacker.
Right. I can't exactly remember what day that was. However, my partner and I work typically a Monday to Friday, 7 o'clock in the morning to 3 o'clock in the afternoon shift. We don't really have we have kind of an informal on call, but the vast majority of our work is one where we can schedule within our standard work week. So I do recall we were in our office together, and we work out of our downtown office. Sorry, our downtown headquarters. We have a headquarters downtown in Toronto, and we face out onto a relatively busy street. Which is very close to Yonge Street. Yonge Street's essentially the main street that divides Toronto. It's kind of the hub to get into the city, and I just remember sitting at my desk and listening to sirens. And it's not uncommon, of course, to hear sirens during the day when you're working downtown. But it was the number of sirens and the number of vehicles that were roaring past our building was extraordinary. Like it was just one constant wail of emergency services, and it was going on for quite a long time. And both my partner and I looked at each other, and we knew something was happening. We just weren't sure exactly what was going on. And then within minutes, our boss came in, and she essentially announced that there had been a terrorist attack in the northern part of the city. Call it Uptown, I guess, or it's in 32 Division, which is sort of the north end of the downtown core. And and then from there, I remember going to her office. She had a television in her office that streamed the news media. And so we were watching the news media of the van attack as it had unfolded. and it was just extremely chaotic. And the news reporting was capturing all of the sort of the chaos as it was unfolding, and it was unlike anything I'd certainly ever experienced or witnessed, and everyone else was basically in shock, standing in the office. And then my boss was a wonderful lady. She very dialed in, and she within a couple of seconds just turned to me and said, "All right, now you got to go up to 32 Division and lend a hand." So it was, I just did essentially what I was told, and she didn't think anything of it. So in doing so, I ended up going back to my office and doing some preliminary work, because I knew that the division where this had occurred would have been overwhelmed with resources and investigators, and it would have been very chaotic to focus and concentrate. But at the early stages of the attack, I learned that the suspect had been taken into custody alive, which was very fortunate. And so in doing so, after making some inquiries, I learned about who he was, and I began to prepare initially for the interview, the custodial interview, assuming, based on the limited information I had, the fact that it was a van attack in a crowded downtown area of the city, lone attacker. And I think I had learned at that particular time that the individual had Muslim connections to the Muslim community. I think his mother was Iranian, his father was Albanian. I just immediately fell into that. I don't want to call it tunnel vision, but I was just drawing on the evidence that I had that this was a lone attack fueled by Islamic extremist ideology. And so I began to prepare for that. I'd done a number of custodial interviews of suspects who had been arrested for plotting terrorist attacks in the city of Toronto and the outlying areas for both the Toronto Police as well as the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And so I was familiar with, at least some degree, I was familiar with the ideology, the extreme Islamic extremist ideology. And so I was drawing on a lot of my experience from past interviews and what I'd gleaned and learned. And so I was at my desk, and I was essentially going through a list of tasks that I normally follow. I tend to be very methodical in my preparation of interviews. And so in doing so, accessing, essentially open source social media sites and things of that nature, but primarily, what the investigation had collected to this point. And I was preparing for the interview, and then now I was probably in my office for about an hour, maybe two. I'd have to look back at my notes. It wasn't that long, but it was long enough that I began to realize I should start making my way up to the division. I can't exactly remember when this occurred. I think it was late in the afternoon. Memory serves me correctly. It was probably around 2:00. I was certainly in the office. I ended up packing up my things and making my way to 32 Division. Before I left the office, I had passed by another unit that was adjacent to my office. The unit was our human trafficking enforcement team. And there were a large number of officers who were focusing on the attack. They were all very interested in what was going on. One of the officers called out to me as I was passing by his office, and he said, "Rob, I'm on the suspect's Facebook page. I'm on his Facebook account, and you might want to look at this." And so I kind of stopped, and I went into his office and stood next to him at his computer. And I realized that the suspect in this particular case had posted a very odd Facebook message on his profile. And I had never seen anything like that before. And he mentioned the Incel rebellion and Chad's and Stacy's, and there was some reference to Canadian military service. I mean, the message was fairly short, but it was very, very cryptic. And so I stepped back for a minute and thought to myself, well, I'll get a copy of that. Went back into my office and I began to do a little bit more research, this time on the Incel sub-community and the ideology around that. And so sort of the floodgates of information started to overwhelm me. And it was very unsettling because I had never heard of this community of incels. I had no idea what it was about. And the more I researched, the more questions I had, and none of this was making any sense. And then I began to obviously sort of follow the timeline of the movement and some of the more notorious individuals who were involved in that particular movement and the attacks that they had committed, primarily in the United States. Things started to come together, and I became more enlightened with regard to this extreme ideology and its anger towards the community. And so that was excuse me, that was very unsettling because I'd wasted essentially several hours preparing for an interview around a particular ideology, and I was wrong. And so I spent a little bit more time at my desk, but knew that time was ticking because similar to most countries and in Western countries and on the globe, you only have so much time to interview or to hold somebody in custody before they have to be brought before the courts. And so in our case, it's 24 hours, and it's just not realistic to interview somebody, keep them up for extended periods of time, and then expect to interview them in the early morning hours of the following day. So in this particular case, I wanted to start the interview as soon as I possibly could, realizing the fact that, of course, I also was challenged with the issue of not knowing everything that I really wanted to know. And I always feel very apprehensive walking into an interview when I don't know everything, or at least everything that I have available to me. So that was very concerning. But nevertheless, I ended up going up to 32 Division, and I did some further work in preparation for the interview, and then ultimately decided to commence the interview, I think just shortly before midnight, or maybe shortly after, I can't remember.
Mm. Yeah, it's a very enormous challenge because terrorist offences obviously are reasonably rare, fortunately, and then when they do occur, many of them die during that attack.
Right.
So the actual opportunity to interview a terrorist is it's very unusual and very uncommon, isn't it? Because simply due to the prevalence rates and the deaths of many of them during the attack, and then you've coupled that with discovering this unusual ideology, which was relatively unheard of at the time. It certainly existed in various spaces of the internet, but it wasn't well known publicly, and it also wasn't well known amongst as a sort of a motivation for offending. So how did you actually get your head around the incel ideology? Because it's very nuanced, isn't it? There's lots of layers and rules and all sorts of intricacies that unless you're quite embedded in it, it's hard to understand.
Yeah, I one of the things that we have available to us within our organization, and it's a bit of a luxury. We can draw on a number of resources, and in this particular case, by the time I got up to 32 Division, there was and I've never actually thanked her, and I feel terrible because she was instrumental in my ability to prepare for this interview. And forgive me, I can't remember her name, but she was a civilian analyst. Crime analysts, and I can't say enough about crime analysts, especially those that really have a strong grasp of their role within the investigative process. They know exactly where to go and the information to glean. And so when I arrived at 32 Division, I met this young civilian analyst who worked for our service, and she provided me a great deal of further insight into the ideology. much more than I had learned or been able to glean from my own readings. And she talked about um, what a Chad was and what a Stacy was, and the various different pills that these people metaphorically consume. But the reality is, and it's interesting because I've gone online and I've looked at some of the comments that are on YouTube, and some people seem to think that I had a vast amount of knowledge about incel, and I was just playing with the suspect in my ignorance. The reality was I was not playing. I was completely ignorant to the movement, and you've got to appreciate the fact that the motivational ideology that surrounded this particular attack was just one aspect of my preparation. I also needed to learn as much as I possibly could about the suspect himself, specifically the evidence that had been gleaned. And in doing so, I was reviewing both live interviews that were being conducted at 32 Division involving friends of the suspect, as well as reviewing interviews of his immediate family members. So I was just inundated with a tremendous amount of information. It was very difficult for me to keep a handle of it all, despite the fact that I had prepared the vast majority of it in an interview preparation document, which I typically do in most of my interviews, and you can see that in the interview video. But when I kept fumbling in the interview, calling the incel movement what was the term I was using? I was using some other celebs. Yeah. So some people on the internet felt that was just a ploy, a tactic of mine, but I just could not. I couldn't wrap my head around incel. I didn't know where. I just, for whatever reason, was having a mental block. I mean, my memory's not that best. It's actually worse now than it was back in 2018. But that's just sort of the pressures that these types of interviews can have. And I may have looked foolish, I guess, but out of the circumstances, I didn't have a lot of time to prepare for that interview. So, and this was something I'd never heard of. So he corrected me a few times when I identified this sub community as celebs, which I celebrities, I guess, but anyway, so it was odd. But this going back to this crime analyst, she worked for our intelligence office, and she was the foundation for which I was able to rely on for that interview. So she deserves a tremendous amount of credit for the work she did, and just stoic, like on point. And it just like what you would see out of the movies. You come to an operations center. It's filled with investigators and detectives. Everybody's on the phone. People are yelling and screaming. There's everybody's got a computer work desk. She came up, introduced herself, well dressed, took me aside, and bang, 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 just nailed down she knew I was there to conduct the interview, just nailed down the key points, was able to answer all my questions. And it was just a very, very comforting feeling, knowing that we had a lot of dedicated, hardworking people that day.
So high stakes, no doubt, high stress as well.
Yeah.
And also you're adding to that as well the uncertainties that come with a terrorist attack, which could be that are there more to come? There's always a lot of unknowns that happen with terrorist attacks. So no doubt that would have added to the pressure of the circumstances and the situation. How did you, with all of that, and you've got the incel ideology as well, which is another layer, how do you work out what to focus on and what to prioritize?
Well, it's a good question. So, having done so many, I've done hundreds of interviews of suspects involved in very, very serious crimes. I mean, this was certainly the most significant criminal event that I had ever been involved in. But it wasn't as if I was immune to really serious offenses, and so I rely heavily on training, and so I follow a template. And so the first thing I typically try to do is I have an interview a written interview preparation document that I prepare, and I've developed it over the years. I know that some interviewers have different techniques in terms of preparing for their interviews. I personally, I need to know as much as I possibly can. I'm just very insecure that way. I don't want to be in an interview where I am saying something that is incorrect. And I know in this particular case, I think I did that a couple of times. And that just simply came from the fact that I didn't have a lot of time to prepare. But it's very unnerving to be called out by a suspect and corrected because your credibility is it can affect your credibility, and it can affect the relationship and the rapport and so forth. So I typically want to know as much as I possibly can. So in doing so, in preparing for most interviews, and I would have done it in this particular case as well, I would have obviously attempted to glean as much information about the facts of the case as I could, from physical evidence, photographs and so forth, physical forensic evidence collected at the scene, through to statement evidence from surviving victims, witnesses, and so forth. There wasn't a lot, to be honest with you. There was a tremendous amount of evidence, don't get me wrong, but it hadn't been collected and organized in a manner in which I could view and then glean and prepare from. So it was really, really chaotic. What I was able to do was gain a better understanding and insight into the Incel ideology through this crime analyst, and review a number of statements that I mentioned. And then with the assistance of the crime analyst as well, what she was able to do was provide me a great deal of information about the suspect himself, in terms of his psychological condition, which I later learned was he had been diagnosed as a high-functioning individual with autism spectrum disorder. He had been bullied in public school growing up. He had a very difficult time, establishing, maintaining friends. He was extremely high-functioning. He was, obviously somebody who had gone on. I should say, obviously, he had gone on to attend post-secondary and was graduating. So all of that information about the individual was fed to me through the crime analyst. And so I was able to learn as much as I could, not just about the attack itself, but the suspect involved. And then I met with the team, the investigative team, the executives of the investigative team. The team itself was probably comprised over 50 investigators at the station alone. I mean, there were police officers that were drawn from all corners of the city to this particular area. So there were hundreds of officers involved, but the team itself was primarily made up of a handful of top executive investigators. I discussed goals, aims, and objectives with the investigators. What is it you want to? What is it that we should achieve? Now, a lot of that is contributed in terms of what they want. So things like is there going to be another attack? Who else is involved? Means of communication with other people. Who motivated this individual. There were a lot of goals that we wanted to achieve during the interview. So they were valuable in sort of fleshing out all of these goals, aims, and objectives. And then what evidence I did have, I would typically categorize from less incriminating to more incriminating in the event that I wanted to present that evidence during the course of the interview. There wasn't a lot, like I said, but I did have some evidence that I was going to rely on. And then looking at investigator topics, right? So, what topics do we want to cover? Some of the things that were really important in this particular case was because the individual had been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. I knew, and sort of the team was very well aware of the fact that could have been used as a defense. That was likely going to be used as a defense in terms of establishing operating mind and intent. So I'm assuming New Zealand's very much the same, in so much as that suspects have an opportunity, if they qualify, to argue that they were insane there's an insanity defense. So that was one of the primary hurdles that I wanted to at least address, if not overcome, during the interview. So in doing so, the team and I were discussing how we were going to do that. And a lot of it had to do with not necessarily focusing, although it was important to focus on the events and the actions of the accused leading up to the offense. It was more important to focus on his thought process and his mindset, right? So, I mean, if he was going to disclose that he was hearing voices and he was being, directed at to commit this, this attack at the direction of a higher power or so on and so forth. And I mean, I would develop those those topics, but if it wasn't, it was something that was more concrete and grounded in its motivation. That was also important. So that was really clear. The other issue, I mean, I don't know how much you want me to get into sort of the hurdles, but there was obviously in Canadian law, it's I don't think we're unique, but the problem that we had in this particular case was, of course, the suspect had been given his obligatory rights to speak to a lawyer, which he did do that. But in Canadian law, if there's a change in jeopardy, in other words, if you've been arrested for a single murder, but and then you speak to a lawyer, defense counsel, to fulfill your charter right obligations, or and then it's later determined during the investigation that you've killed 3 people, the police are required to go back and tell you, okay, you're no longer facing 1 count of first-degree murder. You're now facing 3 counts of first-degree murder. And because jeopardy has been increased, it's changed, it's been elevated, you now have the right to speak to a lawyer again and get further advice. And so in this particular case, one of the challenges that we were faced with was that we just didn't know how many people had been victimized as a result of this terrible act. And so subsequent to his arrest and speaking to legal counsel, the number of fatalities, the number of people who had been killed started to rise. And it was significant. It was, I think at the end, it was something like 10 people had been murdered and 16 people had been seriously injured. And so as the numbers were coming in, our investigative team would go down into the cells. An officer would go down into the cells to advise the suspect of his change in jeopardy, and then give him an opportunity to speak to a lawyer. And I don't want to say unfortunately, that's not probably the right word to use, but when asked whether or not he wanted to speak to counsel again, he said, no, I've already spoken to a lawyer. I don't think there's a need to do that. Now, because he hadn't spoken to counsel when the final number had come in terms of those that had been killed and injured, I had to give him that opportunity during the interview. And what that meant was that partway through the interview, as I'm reiterating his constitutional rights to speak to a lawyer again, he now had the opportunity to stop the interview and speak to a lawyer. And I'm only going to assume that he was going to tell the lawyer what was going on. So that made it much more difficult, because if you see during the interview that happens, when he comes back, he's much more bolstered in his confidence to not to talk, and that was another hurdle. So there were a lot of issues around planning for this interview that we had to consider. There were a lot of topics that we needed to flesh out. I also wanted to know what evidence we had in terms of holdback. I needed to know what evidence I wasn't likely going to be able to disclose, or the investigating officer didn't want me to disclose during the interview. So, there's a number of different steps that I take when I prepare for an interview, and it's an involved process, but it's necessary, because if if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. I think it's who said that? It was George Washington, I believe, or somebody. But the planning and preparation process of an interview is the foundation for a successful interview. I've in some cases, I'm thinking back, I've taken 6 months to plan and prepare for an interview. So that was one of the challenges in this particular case. There wasn't a lot of time to plan or prepare.
Yeah, so you've had hours essentially to develop a plan on the fly for a very complex offending matter. How important then does your interviewing skills become, and how important is something like rapport for an interview like this?
Yeah, well, rapport is, I mean, for anyone who has, even a remote understanding of investigative interviewing and specifically that of interviewing suspects, rapport is the foundation for a successful interview. That, next to only, I think, the perception of the evidence that the suspect believes has been seized. And I find, rapport is obviously crucial. So the problem with rapport is it's an enigma. I mean, everybody has this understanding of what rapport is, or they have a kind of a loose understanding of what rapport is. But when you're in an interview room with an individual you've never met before, and you only know based on the information that you've gleaned through interviews of family and friends and the evidence collected, coupled with this horrific event that is unfathomable. Like it's so hard to conceive how somebody could possibly, even think of committing an event of this magnitude. Never mind fulfilling this crime. So rapport is, rapport is a very difficult theory, I guess, for lack of a better word. So I think rapport, as much as the research is as much as there's been a great deal of research surrounding the issue of rapport, and I think we can learn a lot from rapport, from basically from academia. At the end of the day, I think it really boils down to the individual. And I know that despite what we know in terms of how to build rapport, and I can talk about how I build rapport. At the end of the day, if you don't have that innate, I don't want to say quality, because I mean maybe it's a quality, but it's a characteristic certainly. If you don't have that innate characteristic within you to be able to be flexible and adaptable in the room, I think it was Melissa Rossano who said that. Wonderful researcher out of the U.S. He's done a lot of work with federal law enforcement. You have to be flexible and adaptable in that room, because the problem that often, well, certainly the problem that I encounter routinely is when you walk into a room, this is a brand new individual. It's not like suspects are cut from the same cloth, right? I mean, they all have their uniqueness, and some can be very overwhelming and resistant, uncooperative. Others can be very meek and subordinate, and then you got a range of individuals in between. And so, in order to adapt to the individual in the room, and in this particular case, I hadn't interviewed a lot of people with autism spectrum disorder. I had interviewed a lot of individuals with personality disorders. And in some cases, I suppose I've probably interviewed in the past people with cognitive disabilities, but this was very apparent to me, and there was a great deal of. I knew there was going to be a great deal of media attention covering not just this attack, but if anything was gleaned from the interview, there'd be a great deal of media attention focused around the interview. So it was. I don't know, I'm kind of speaking about it from a roundabout way. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I look at essentially three things. I try to, well, that's not true. I look at a number of different aspects to build rapport. One, I think it's important to be open-minded and understanding. It's important to be empathetic. At the end of the day, despite my own beliefs, I try to at least present in a manner that is interested and understanding of the suspect's position. I try to introduce things like humor and when appropriate. I won't do it, of course, if it's not appropriate. But and paying compliments. I think people like appropriate compliments. I look heavily on or for things that I might have in common with the individual. In this particular gentleman's situation, he was. I knew he had some military background. He was highly picked on through his uh, formative years in public school, um, and so he did have autism spectrum disorder, although I don't think he admitted to it. But I have friends and family of children with autism. They're on the spectrum, so I had some familiarity with that. My father was in the military. That was the truth. Because we were in the military, we moved quite often, and it was very difficult for me to establish long-term friends with, people that I was going to school with. And so, I understood what it meant to be picked on and, singled out as different because, I experienced a lot of that growing up myself. But I think a lot of it has to do with just the fact that you have to have those intrinsic characteristics of empathy and understanding. It sounds well, not counterintuitive. I don't think that's what I'm trying to say. It sounds like you're perhaps maybe placating or you're soft, but the reality is, the work is not about imposing your opinions on an individual. The work is about eliciting that information from the suspect. And nobody wants to talk to somebody who's dominant or authoritarian in the interview room. I mean, that's the science is very clear. And I think that's where we fall down in law enforcement. We tend to take a very dominant, for those who are inexperienced. And that's why I go back to the fact that I think that these types of roles within law enforcement need to be done by individuals who are specialized. Because the vast, well, I'm just speaking anecdotally, but the nature of our work, we tend to be very authoritarian, right? We have to be, because there are circumstances where we need to take control of situations. And that can often be displayed in an interview room, especially if you get frustrated or you're angry or you start to impose your beliefs and opinions on an individual. So that's problematic. I hope I answered your question. I don't know if I did or not. But,
no, you did. There's the academic version of rapport, isn't there, which is what it looks like on paper and in a textbook, and then there's the implementation of that and what that's like to do in a face-to-face interaction with someone. And there are intangible attributes to that, as you say, but one of the keys probably is to be person-centered, to be able to focus on the individual in front of you, but also have the awareness, as you're pointing out, to bring it back to you and question yourself and ask, what is it about me that
right.
will allow me to relate to this individual? And you pointed out several things which were spot on. You might not have had many similarities, but you're able to draw out the similarities between both of you, so the commonalities. Right. And then there were certainly points in there where you were validating and recognize the individual, despite
Right.
highly disapproving of what they've done. You are able to be person-centered and recognize them in that moment, and then bring in some lightheartedness at times to foster that rapport. So I think that is really important to point out. It's a skill, but it's very important as well.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, and then there's not a lot of research around the effects of things like humor and paying compliments. There's a great deal of research about building commonality, and it's not just within police interviewing. It's any type of negotiation. I know Robert Cialdini's done a lot of work on the one persuasion principle liking, and he talks at length about building relationships with people before you enter into negotiations, whether they're business contracts or other types of negotiations, and building commonality. his eighth principle now, I think, is unity, which is, essentially looking for something that identifying unity that you hold with the other person, in common. So, commonality is not something that's unknown, but there's not a lot of, from what I'm aware of, not a lot of research around humor and paying compliments, other than, what I've heard from, like I said, Melissa Rossano, I believe is her name. But I find it very effective. I think if just in general conversation that I have, and I practice a little bit of my work in my interactions with people that I first meet. And one of the things that I've noticed in my conversations when I first meet people, individuals who are very, very, what's the term? They tend to, they're very likable. They tend to be individuals who are funny. They're people you want to be in company with.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of their humor is self-deprecating, and I try to introduce a lot of self-deprecating humor because I think it shows a high degree of humility. I really think it's important, right? I mean, humility is a very important quality, I think, and that's really, again, another area that fosters rapport. When a person can see you not as a person in authority, but as a human being, and you're seeing them in the same light, not as an offender or some monster, but you're seeing them as a human being, and it's a difficult thing to do. It truly is, and some crimes are harder to deal with than others, but at the end of the day, I think that's where it's so important to find the right people to specialize in this kind of unique area of policing, because it's so very important. The spoken word of the accused is probably I feel is probably the most profound piece of evidence that we'll ever seize in a criminal investigation. And too often, I think as investigators, we rely heavily on our forensic units to solve our cases, and we don't understand, or perhaps we feel we're not going to be successful in eliciting the spoken word from the accused person. And I've never been like that. I've always found it fascinating, and so it's something that I think is really, really important.
That's a very, very good point, and it has probably been lost a little bit with the emergence of forensic science over the last few decades. So rapport was clearly one of the priorities for you in the interview. What about other techniques and strategies? Were there any that you found that you needed to utilize in interviewing the suspect?
Yeah, well, everything from interview room setup, interviewing, the individual alone, reducing anxiety and stress. When you're in a more comfortable room environment, although, some people might criticize the interview room I conducted the interview in, but that's actually, I know it says on the video hard interview room. That's not a hard interview room. That's their only soft interview room in 32 years that I'm aware of. And so, it's carpeted. It's got, relatively benign walls, and, I think there's a window there. But comfortable chairs and settings and things of that nature, moving the furniture out of the way to prevent the individual from lying down on it. These were all, from a room setup. These were all strategies that I had used to build and maintain rapport. But primarily it was around reducing stress and anxiety and apprehension, and reducing the unknown factor. So I didn't want him thinking about the fact that he was going to get hurt, or that there were any external threats that he had to concern himself with. You can see at the very beginning of the interview, he tends to have a very stoic sort of posture. His answers are singular. They're very kind of pointed and expressionless, and he's essentially espousing in my opinion, the advice that he got from counsel. He's willing to answer certain questions, but not willing to answer others. He's very kind of stoic in his presentation, and and then as time sort of unfolds, and I think as he realizes, that not only is there's going to be no external threats. I'm not going to harm him in any kind of way. He's not going to be harmed, and I'm able to develop a relationship with him through commonality and humor and compliments. That takes. I think it took a positive effect, and I think it was that was important because in his posture he begins to open up, and I mean that in so much as that he's. I think he at some point he begins to swivel in his chair and things like that. And I'm not suggesting that posture, nonverbal behavior is in any way an indication of deception, or we can rely on that. But what it does, it's very clear to me that if somebody's uptight and they're uncooperative and resistant, they can they can manifest that in their presentation, right? They can be curt, they can frown, and they can be short tempered. And in the beginning, I felt he was very resistant, but as sort of the interview progressed, through not only the external environment, but through I would argue my approach in terms of focusing a large portion of the beginning of the interview on him and his background, his education, his accomplishments, his relationships with other students, his relationships with his family, his relationships with, or his attempted relationships with girlfriends. That really sort of began to open the door up for having, a more open, spontaneous conversation, where he was ultimately able to, I think, feel comfortable in the end to kind of espouse his, narcissistic ideology and use the interview as kind of a platform to educate not just myself. I believe he's probably trying to educate the world in terms of, why he did what he did.
Mm-hmm.
So I hope that answered your question. But it's a combination of both the external environment as well as the approach, right? That gets people to open up, I think.
I find that really interesting. Talking about the posture, it's probably one of the intangibles that you can see a shift around, but it's not always a reliable measure or marker, but it potentially indicates a level of comfort, maybe, and also he was quite a rigid individual, and the fact that he's becoming more comfortable, greater flexibility potentially in hearing
Right.
different opinions and perspectives as the interview goes on. So, yeah, that ability to have the flexibility, or the suspect to have the flexibility to start shifting in their demeanor and presentation, it does become quite a good guide, doesn't it? That they're a little bit more settled in the setting, and as you point out as well, the threat aspect, potentially
Right.
the threat of the interview and the situation and the various scenario reduces, or they become more settled to that, and then they're able to open up more.
Yeah, I mean, communication is a very complex, process. I mean, it's, I think it was Moravian that authored a paper talking about communication is made up of 7% verbal, 32% paralinguistic, and the vast majority is nonverbal. And the reality is, we know that that's just not true. Communication is a very complex process, and it incorporates or involves a vast number of issues. Not just verbal and nonverbal behavior. I mean, there's and so I do tend to, during the course of an interview, I do tend to focus on the presentation of the subject, because I think obvious cues like short one-answered answers to a question versus more open-ended long narratives is indicative of somebody who's more relaxed and willing to speak. I mean, that's just common sense. Somebody who is less accusatory and what's the term I'm looking for? Less angry in the interview versus somebody who becomes more understanding and willing to talk about their thought process and what took place. I mean, obviously that's a shift, right? So I do look at that, and certainly when I'm asking questions, and in this particular case, it was fairly evident at the beginning of the interview, I would ask a particular question, and there were some times when he was willing to answer, other times when he wasn't, and so I was acutely aware of the areas in which he was very sensitive about and did not want to talk about those areas, and so I try to manage that. Uh, that minefield of cooperativeness delicately. But I mean, that again comes from experience. Oftentimes I find that as the interview progresses, and I think in this particular case it worked well. I may ask a question initially at the beginning of an interview and get a hard resistance in terms of response. But then as time goes on and I've been able to develop rapport, I can ask the same question maybe in a different way, and the subject will answer it. So it's communication is very complex, and it's not just a matter of breaking it down into three categories. And there's so much more that to consider. So.
Did you find that there were any particular challenges in the interview that popped up?
Well, no, there were a number of challenges. So, the biggest challenge, interestingly, was not the suspect himself. He, and I'm not trying to suggest it was an easy interview. I mean, it wasn't. But I've interviewed some really, really difficult individuals who've been charged with not to the same degree as the Venn attack, but people who've murdered other individuals, and they're angry individuals, very uncooperative, and almost toxic in the room, and those are challenging interviews. This individual wasn't challenging. The challenges that I faced in this particular case was more external. It was the media pressure that I knew that was. That the attack was going to garner, and as the suspect began to disclose, I began to. It was kind of odd. I was listening to it, but I really wasn't listening to it because I started to separate myself from the conversation, and I was beginning to think about the impact of what he was saying on the larger investigation and whether or not I just assumed that this was going to come to the attention of the media. And so that I don't want to say it was necessarily, there was a lot of pressure in that respect, I guess, because I knew that, like I mentioned, it was going to garner a great deal of interest, and not just locally. It was going to be under the circumstances, it was likely going to be at least nationally, if not across the globe. So I was acutely aware that the manner in which I was conducting the interview would likely come under criticism. But I was confident in the training and and my experience. So that wasn't too much of an issue. The challenges of having to provide the individual further legal counsel, that was a challenge at the beginning. Trying to think of some of the other ones. I suppose at the end of the day, it was in any case like this, I don't want to let down the investigative team. I mean, they've chosen me to help them, and I take that to heart. I mean, I really do. And in this particular case, the challenge, the main challenge was that I just didn't have time to prepare. And not that any investigative team I've worked for has ever come back to me and said, you did a terrible job. I could have done better. They're very complimentary. But I can't help but think that in those cases in the past where I failed, I say failed. I've always done my best, but I mean, where I haven't been able to, list any further evidence to assist in moving the case forward. So I was cognizant of that as well. I didn't want to let the team down because I knew they were relying heavily on the interview. So so there was the media attention, and then the individual himself, just in terms of his cognitive limitations. Those were concerning. So I thought, there could be some challenges in court and so forth. But I think it worked out in the end.
And what about the role of ideology? So obviously our suspect and offender identify with the incel ideology. Do you feel that the ideology aspect, particularly in cases like this or mass casualty attacks, does that add another layer of complexity to the interview?
I think it does, absolutely. I think, and all the more reason why I think we need to rely on external resources to assist us in these investigations. And I could see at some point in the future, police organizations, certainly the larger ones, much like our civilian intelligence agencies, focus on particular areas of crime. Larger law enforcement organizations developing forensic interviewers who are specialists in a particular field of crime, whether it's organized crime, drug importation, murder, sexual assault, or terrorism. Because at the end of the day, and despite the fact that rapport is one of the key ingredients to a successful interview, relying on the perception of evidence that you have is second only onto rapport. And if you're in that interview room and you have no idea what it is you're talking about, and you're shooting kind of from the hip, or you're just ignorant to the ideology as a whole, that I think can impact to some degree, to a large degree, your ability to build a relationship with that person, and it can impact the perception of evidence if you decide to later rely on that later. It's not going to have the same effect. In other words, if I'm a hardened ideologically minded insurgent who's been captured because my country, my community, my family, my children have been affected by political outside interference for generations, and I have this built up hatred over all of that time, or at least all the time that I've been alive, and I'm being now interviewed by somebody who's just a buffoon who just doesn't understand. That's I would just that you can only appreciate that the individual being interviewed, the suspect, is going to have a certain degree of contempt for that person. Like, how dare you come into this room and even think that you have any understanding of what it is that I'm going through? And and so terrorist attacks are very complicated, right? I mean, there are so many moving parts, and it's so difficult to keep up with the latest information as it's unfolding, and it's a really, really difficult area of work. I have a difficult time interviewing terrorists just simply because I don't have the time to focus on that particular niche within sort of law enforcement. So I mean, we struggle, I think, as law enforcement to deal with those issues, but they're becoming more and more frequent. They're becoming more and more of a concerning issue. And we're seeing them, more and more across the globe. And it's not just enough to throw in even a seasoned detective and expect that they're going to get anything done. It's the service, in my opinion, is if a police service were to do that, not only are you putting your service's reputation at risk, you're holding that particular detective, that investigator, vulnerable, because I mean, certainly if the interview is recorded, it could very well likely make its way into the public domain, and now you've got an interview that's open for public scrutiny and criticism across the globe. And we might say, well, that's part of the job, and it's, at the end of the day, there's nothing you can do about that. But you have to kind of suck it up. But it's I don't like to be reminded of my mistakes, and certainly in situations where you just haven't given opportunity to develop your skill set, it can have a big impact on the morale of your members, and it's doing a disservice for the investigation, right? So. I don't know I don't know if there's any easy answer to that, but I think at the end of the day, the interviewing officer, if you're assigned to interview an individual who's committed a very specific, serious act, like an act of terrorism, where there is a unique ideology that's motivated that individual, extremist ideology, you better know what it is that's going on inside that person's head. And if you don't, then I think you need to change, because the world's a changing place, and its information is moving very fast. And inherently, unfortunately, we as police organizations, I find we tend to be a little slow when it comes to keeping up with these changes, and it's hard. But I can't say enough for certainly the Toronto Police Intelligence Unit, and this the crime analyst that I was working with. It's almost as if she knew exactly what was going on, and she had some prior knowledge of all of this information. It wasn't certainly something that she just gleaned within that day. She was specialized. So even as the interviewer, even if you don't have that information, you should have it at your fingertips. And so if you have to take a break and leave, consult with your investigative team. You need somebody within your organization who's a specialist in that particular area. You may even want to invite that person into the interview once rapport has been established, and the individual is less uncooperative and more willing to speak. But we need to we need to specialize. The idea of generalist constable is not a good idea, in today's field of law enforcement. I think we really need to know what it is we're doing. It bolsters our credibility and our success.
That's a really interesting point about whether you could bring a criminal intelligence analyst into the interview as a way to open up that dialogue. I'm sure that hasn't been done often, but there will be instances globally where potentially we are caught out without specialist interviewers that have that expertise in certain ideologies. So that would be, that'd be a fascinating option to explore. It was also interesting that the decision was made by the judge to publicly release the suspect interview. In some ways, it certainly, I think, has opened up many people's eyes around the incel ideology. I know myself, through watching that interview, it was quite remarkable to hear the extent of the ideology and the various terms and aspects that were associated with that. And I think for many people, that was probably their first glimpse in some ways into the incel ideology. So from an educational perspective, it certainly probably has exposed a lot of people, maybe for the good or for the bad, to that ideology. For you personally, was that difficult to have that publicly released and for it to garner so much global attention?
It was difficult, yes, because I was I think I was challenged with the idea that I didn't want to be portrayed as somebody, and I know, and there were some social media conversations that I was portrayed as buying into this individual's ideology, praising him for what he did. There were a lot of very poisonous sort of comments made that I was, I was shaking his hand, befriending him, and I think if I had a chance to do it again, I would have done things maybe a little bit differently. I know there would certainly be some things I would have done differently, but it left me not so much with the feeling of like dealing with personal criticism as much as I was concerned about the effect that it would have on the families of the victims that survived and the individuals who lived through that attack. And I mean, people can often look at something, and if they don't understand the context in which it's occurring, they can jump to conclusions. And I know in one particular case, I received an email from a family member, and she praised me for the work that I had done. But I know that there were some other individuals that had a difficult time understanding why it was that I took the approach that I did. And so, it's not always available to us to explain to the people who have been so horrifically impacted by an event like this, to say to them, look, this is what the science and research has told us. I'm following, an evidence-based best practice. I think the vast majority of the victims who survived and the family members of those who were lost, I think they understand the importance of the interview and the impact it had on the ultimate outcome in court with the convictions. That there was the argument of insanity was shot down. I think that interview played a big part, or at least somewhat of a part, in the judge's decision. So I think the vast majority of the people who were directly involved in this had an understanding, but it's that would be that was my biggest concern. And it's I'm always, and it's one of the reasons why I've been very reluctant to talk about this. It's just been, some of the people have been deeply affected by this, not just, and I don't want to just say the victims. And of course, the surviving victims and their families have been the most devastated over this. But we also have to consider the community at large. This was a very busy area of Toronto. It's a vibrant area. It's there were a large number of people who were out on that day walking the streets, that live in that area, that go to business, do business in that area, who were all so deeply affected by what took place. The first responders who attended. I know officers within our own service have had to deal with crippling after effects of attending the scene. I didn't attend the scene. I didn't have to do that. And these people often don't get recognized. So I'm just very, very sensitive to, people's feelings, because this is, this was an event that changed our life forever, for the worse. And so it's really, really, it's unfathomable. Like I can't comprehend, what the people who are directly involved in this, what they're having to go through. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm trying to. And I've always been mindful of respecting certainly the individuals who were directly involved, the victims who survived, the family members who lost their loved ones, and first responders, and the community. It was a horrible day, terrible day.
I mean, I appreciate that, and it speaks to just the gravity of these events, and for anyone that's involved in that one way or the other, whether at the police level or the emergency services level, or even tragically family members of victims. It's devastating. And from a police perspective, it throws challenges your way, particularly as the interviewer, where you have a task to do, and that's to interview the suspect, interview the offender, and that task is to try and establish an account, to try and determine what has occurred, to get the truth, to get information out of them. And it's a lot to navigate. There's a role to do, and you need to use tactics and skills to do that. role, but it does create dilemmas. So, you're trying to achieve the outcomes of the interview. You're trying to get also, of course, justice for the victims, but they don't necessarily always marry up in what you might need to do to carry out the interview to get the information and to get a confession. So it is challenging, and particularly that then is publicly released as well.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, my role actually, just, the interesting part about my role was that it was made public. And I think your question initially was about the interview being made public. And I'm not going to second guess Justice Malloy's decision, but I've never experienced a situation like that. So I thought that was somewhat unique. But in the end, my role was relatively small. I'm not trying to suggest it wasn't a significant part of the investigation. I think it was, but the reality is where people don't seem to understand what they don't seem to understand is that there were a lot of first responders at the scene, hundreds, and the trauma that they must have witnessed was just horrific. I just couldn't imagine. And they go anonymous. They go without being noticed. So it's I'm alive to that. It's sad.
Probably the most unsettling aspect for the interview for me in watching it was you got the full account from our perpetrator, and at the very end, as you're closing up the interview, he makes the statement that I accomplished my mission. How did you sort of sit back and take that statement at the end and try and process that at the conclusion of the interview?
I think I was shocked. I was absolutely shocked. I wasn't expecting that. I mean, it just exemplified, and I shouldn't use these words because I'm not a psychiatrist or psychologist, but this narcissistic contempt, this vile narcissistic personality that just so toxic, and had no understanding of the impact of his actions and the devastation that he caused. Just no remorse, and I was shocked, and I was so saddened by that. I really was. I can only hope that. I mean, I'm not one for espousing revenge or anything like that. That's not my job. But I can only hope that he's had an opportunity to reflect and really consider the impact of his actions on that day. And I hope he's reminded of that. And I hope that that's something that haunts him for the rest of his life.
Mm.
It was just really, really shocking. Yeah.
I think on that note, Rob, it might be the perfect time to wrap things up and bring that to an end. I really appreciate your time today. I know you've been asked a lot over the years to do interviews, and it's been something that you've been very guarded and hesitant about. And look, it's a wonderful opportunity for people to hear your side of the story and to understand things, I think, from your perspective, and also the process that you had to go through that day to carry out the interview, and of course learn a bit about you and your history of time with the Toronto Police Service and your involvement in police interviews while you were there. So, look, I do appreciate that it's not an easy topic to revisit, but your time and I think your accounts and insights have been very valuable.
Well, I look at Nathan. I thank you. It's people like yourself who do excellent work. You're obviously very engaged in your work with New Zealand police. You love what you do. I was the same, and I'm more than open to working with other law enforcement agencies and researchers. I know we've done work in the past, and we'll likely continue to do work in the future. So if there's anything I can do to move that ability to teach and inform primarily investigators forward, I'm open for it. I thank you for all your hard work. You're dedicated. You just you're doing this on your own time. I know that, and I think it's valuable. And I think the more that we as practitioners and academics build those relationships for the purposes of just doing tomorrow's work better, then we reduce the mistakes we've made in the past, the false confessions, miscarriages of justice, and we continue to capitalize on building a relationship and just doing a good job, because that's why we got into this business in the first place. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Rob.
Thank you for listening to the Targeted Violence podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, please support the show by subscribing. Stay tuned for more episodes.